Praise the Lord! With the 1-2-3 combo of Fire Emblem Heroes, Echoes and Warriors last year, along with the genuinely egregious lack of any news on it, it'd be easy to forget that the next installment of the series is still slated for later this year on the Switch. But with any luck, there should be some news for us right around the corner at the time of writing at E3. The lack of information, plus all the time to speculate, has fans all kinds of curious about what the new game's going to be like though. What will the world be like? Will the gameplay be unique? Will there be an avatar that lets you fondle your big sister again? Me personally though, one of the things I'm most curious about is what the lord of the new game is going to be like. For newcomers, a lord is essentially the main protagonist of their game. Think Marth, Ike, Erica, or Corrin. A while back, out of curiosity, I posted a thread on the Fire Emblem subreddit asking people what qualities attract them to their favourite lords, or in other words, what they look for in a lord. The fanbase being what it is, I got a lot of very insightful answers, and my fair share of memes. The feedback I got made me pretty interested in how one would make a lord that hit everybody's benchmarks. So today, I'm going to take these ideas that I saw and try to collate them into a template of the most widely appealing lord possible. I structured the template into 4 pillars. I'm going to go over each one, briefly explain the significance behind it, some of the things that people said they liked, give some potential ideas, and along the way I'll mention some lords that I think are winning examples. Then at the end we'll tie it all together. Keep in mind, this isn't going to be that specific, it's very much a rough template, more like a checklist than me saying this is precisely what the lord needs to look and sound and act like. With that out of the way, let's get to it. Kicking off with arguably the most important aspect of the lord is their overall character. A strong, or at least likeable character, is pretty essential if the player is to get invested in them. It doesn't really matter what happens to the protagonist if you don't care about them, right? Now, I should explain what I mean when I say character. When I say it, what I mean is everything from their age, personality, and background, to their goals, motivations, flaws, and relationships. Essentially, everything that defines both what the character represents and who they are as a person. So, how do we make a strong character for a lord? From what I've seen, 2 things especially are key. The first is the lord's personality. There's a lot to be said for likability, charm, and just being entertaining. This can be slightly tricky to nail down, because players are so different from one another, and will gravitate to different personalities, just like in real life. And while the lords do have some common threads between them, they are still quite distinct. Marth is different from Ephraim, who's different from Micaiah, who's different from our boy. Often though, lords are split into 2 rough categories in discussion: the traditional and noble hero type, and the wild, coarse, vaguely anti-heroic type, with some that float in between, and Corrin, who is wherever the game needs them to be. Speaking personally for a moment, personality is key in order for me to like a character. It doesn't really matter how deep or complex or nuanced the character writing is. If I don't vibe with them as a person, they're unlikely to get more than passive respect from me. Case in point, Alm is my favourite lord, and it doesn't have a lot to do with his writing within the plot, or as a character within the narrative. I personally like him because I just really dig his attitude. He's positive, polite, full of resolve, has a good sense of humour, and is generally just a cool guy to me, which makes me enjoy experiencing the story with him and makes me want to follow him. With that said, if we're looking for a lord that will appeal to many different people on a personality front, I think a multifaceted approach might be the best option. Show a lord that has a few different dimensions to their personality that the game draws out over the course of a plot, while keeping their decisions and dialogue consistent with the outlook and personality that they demonstrated over the course of the game. That not only gives the character more depth, but affords them the time to develop and grow, adding intrigue to them, and encouraging the audience to emotionally invest in whatever it is that they do. Without that, the character can come off stale and disconnected from the plot. This multifaceted approach also gives the opportunity for a wider range of people to relate to them. A pretty recent example of this kind of writing is Celica, who's put into various difficult situations and forced to make tough decisions over the course of her story, with her outlook on the world ultimately changing due to the journey that she went through. And speaking of relatability, that's the other key element that I saw commonly. Projecting onto your main protagonist is a pretty common phenomenon in any kind of story, and Fire Emblem games are no exception. I mean, that's probably half the reason Robin and Corrin are so popular within the wider fanbase. But even outside of the avatars, just look at the Fire Emblem Heroes Choose Your Legends polls. Those are dominated by main protagonists. So, how do we convey relatability? Honestly, there's a lot of options. Just throwing out some previous examples in the series, some relate to Roy's story of growing into a responsibility that he's not ready for, some relate to Erica's naivety to the world, some to Arm's dream of getting out of his backwater hometown and making something of himself, and some to Ike essentially just being a normal guy facing impossible odds, fighting everything from animal people to literal goddesses. What's really important is that, beneath whatever is going on, there's an identifiable human struggle. Related to this is some kind of notable flaw that the Lord either needs to overcome, or that noticeably handicaps him during the story. If our Lord is too lacking in this, it can come off as inhumanly perfect, or just flat out annoying. And that can attract the dreaded Mary Sue label, which we definitely don't want. I've seen this complaint leveled at, well, actually damn near every Lord besides like Sigurd and Leif. And I suspect half the reason for that is just because people haven't even played their games. The Lord's relationships with the people around them can be a great way to help endear them to the player, and the biggest weapon that Fire Emblem has in that regard is the support system. In my opinion, the best example of a support system being used to a Lord's advantage is Eliwood. From the dissection of his will to fight alongside his friends in his Marcus and Harkon supports, to showcasing his self-aware optimism in his Fiora support, his supportiveness and open-mindedness in his friendship with Lyn, his bromance with Hector, and of course his fairy tale romance with Ninian, Eliwood's supports flesh him out in a way that adds a lot more weight and feeling to what he goes through in the story, and I think we should look at him as a prime example of what a good Lord support range looks like. I won't go on about him too much, but I will urgently suggest that you check out Gast's support science on Eliwood if you haven't already. For real, that video alone helped Eliwood become one of my favourite characters in the franchise. For me, ideally the Lord will have supports with at least their whole entourage, if not the other members of their group. By this, I mean family that they're travelling with, close friends, their love interest if they have one, and perhaps their retainer if there's room. By doing this, we get a holistic look at them and their personality in their off time, as well as how they treat the people close to them, and ultimately, that's what we really want from our Lord here, I think. A well fleshed out character with a clearly defined outlook, some interesting dynamics with the people around them, and enough charm to make us really want to follow them, and see the world through their eyes. And speaking of eyes, that brings me to the next pillar. One of the most popular answers on the thread was a good design, and I can totally understand why. Shallow or not, a good design can make or break a character for some people, including me to an extent, so it's important to nail it. What I mean by design is very simple: their outfit, eye color, hair color and style, all the way to their gender, body type, skin color, personal weapon, and voice acting if they have it. Of course, while it's important to have a good design, what makes one inherently good is pretty subjective, so it can also be hard to pin down. There's a great video by one of my favourite YouTubers, Super Eyepatch Wolf, on what makes a good character design, that I'd really recommend if you're interested in the topic. His take on good design is relatively similar to mine. In my opinion, a good character design is one that isn't necessarily just easy on the eyes, but that explains the character and tells you a bit of a story about them. That being said, given that Lords are the ones that you'll be following over the course of the game, and that as humans, we're in general more partial towards people that we find physically attractive, it'd be prudent to make the Lord aesthetically pleasing in at least some way, without devolving into overly blatant pandering, or generic design cliches. The last thing we want is for our Lord to be forgettable. The design should be almost like a silent pitch for them. Let's take Chrom as an example. Chrom's game, Awakening, whilst being a last-ditch attempt at drawing in fans, was also a celebration of all things Fire Emblem, and Chrom matches that vibe. His hair is the typical blue of Fire Emblem Lords, telling you that he's your protagonist from the jump, but let's go a bit deeper. Like most Lords before him, his outfit is based in regality, being a mixture of white and literally royal blue, which immediately tells you of his noble heritage, but that's contrasted by his tattered cape and bare shoulder, which convey an informal, action-oriented personality, perfectly befitting the leader of a militia like the Shepherds. His outfit boasts a pair of pantaloons, a piece of clothing that was initially worn by nobility in 18th century Europe, but went on to become casual day wear for everyman by the 1800s. This subtly illustrates the balance between Chrom's noble stature and bearing, and his more down-to-earth personality. On top of that, the brand of the Exalt showing on his exposed shoulder tells you both that Chrom is very open about his position, as well as foreshadowing that he actually becomes Exalt during the course of the game, as an exposed brand is a trait that he shares with both the current Exalt at the time, Emran, and the future Exalt, his daughter Lucina. And on top of that, The location of his brand illustrates the kind of ruler he's going to be, contrasting Emerin, who had the brand on her forehead, which symbolized her wisdom and leading the people with her words and manner, and Lucina, whose brand in her eye symbolized her quest to save the future in front of her. Crom's brand on his shoulder, specifically that of his sword arm, symbolizes his more martial nature and capability of leading his people from the front line as a warrior. But more viscerally than all that, well, he's hot. His conventionally attractive face, muscled but not too yoked body, I mean seriously, take a look at the definition on those biceps. That boy's been doing his curls. And his both strong and gentle voice, provided by Matt Mercer, earned him a lot of fans. If the reception he's got from my female friends is any indication, Crom's design definitely hits the mark. The third pillar I'm going to touch on is plot. No, not that kind of plot. I mean the kind of story that the Lord goes through, and their place in the overall narrative. This extends to their position in their world. For example, whether they're a prince, noble, or even just a common mercenary. We can also have world building come in here, as this can help contextualize the Lord's actions and worldview. Like, say the game is set in some kind of nation with a seedy underbelly, kind of like Norm. A lord who's been leading a pampered life of being fed grapes and taking dips in hot springs may not quite get how everything works, and their naivete may cause issues for them down the line. Whereas a lord lower down on the social ladder will likely be a little more street smart and worldly, and this may be able to let them bypass these issues. One commenter mentioned Lynn as an example of this being done pretty well, and I agree. Lynn is a Sakaean not just in name, like how she deals with Ukai, or how she won't take the insults from Senator Guy with the Flaming Palace, even though she needs his support. She just feels so very proud of her lineage. With just one character, Blazing Blade does a pretty good job of illustrating the Sakaean lifestyle, attitude, and history to an extent. And it helps both Lynn and the Sakaeans as a whole feel like a true part of a Lieb, when they could have very easily come off like just some random tribe if you hadn't already played Binding Blade. The second scenario the commenter mentioned is a particularly interesting one, because it actively shapes the way that Lynn's story mode goes. While it could have ended right then and there if Lynn had swallowed her pride, her place within the world as a proud Sakaean, and not just a proud Sakaean, but one of the only ones left, actively blocks that direction, and leads her to a new one. By doing this, you add not just a plot twist, but you kind of reinforce in the player's mind that this story isn't just about Lynn going out saving people, it's very much a personal journey that she's making on her own terms. More than just their place in the world and what exactly they're doing, the Lord's overall significance in the events of the game's plot means something as well. It's important to remember that just because a Lord is the main character, their overall importance and influence on their world doesn't necessarily have to be that great. They can be the most important character in their story without being the most important character in everybody else's. Using Lynn as an example again, she honestly isn't that relevant to the overall plot of Blazing Blade, and as a result, the plot of her story is far smaller scale than your typical Fire Emblem plot, and more intensely personal. Ultimately, the fate of the world doesn't rest on her shoulders in Lynn mode. Yes, she is trying to dethrone a corrupt and evil noble and free her land, but first and foremost, she's really just a girl who's lost everyone she knows, trying to find and rescue her last known relative and reclaim some piece of family. And once she rejoins the player in Eliwood and Hector mode, she still isn't super critical in many of the events that come next. Rather, her role in the plot is nothing more than to be there for the family that she's come to see Eliwood and Hector as, which in my opinion is a nice counterbalance to the more overt save the world mission that Eliwood and Hector have hanging over their heads, as well as reinforcing Blazing Blade's more character-driven narrative. However, not everyone feels the same way that I do, and Lynn has caught a fair amount of flack for not being relevant enough in the game's plot, and feeling somewhat pointless. Conversely, you can have a lord like Corin, who is literally the deciding factor of the war between the two greatest powers of their world, and their choice in the branch of fate ultimately decides who gets to win, so their involvement in the plot is massively important, which was met with a debatable response. Suffice it to say, there's something of an art to tailoring the stakes of the plot to the personal stakes for the Lord. On the one hand, if they're gassed up too much, it can feel jarring, but too little, and what you do in the story can feel irrelevant. The final pillar we're going to touch on today, which is arguably the simplest and least important, is how the Lord functions as a unit in gameplay. Gameplay can be used as a way to tacitly tell a story about the Lord, whether it's in their outlook, their growth in ability, or just their physical constitution. From Roy going from being almost a liability for most of Binding Blade to beasting everything after promoting and getting the Sword of Seals, to American badass Ephraim literally never picking fights he can't win with his bases and growth rates, the Lord's gameplay can be the bridge between their character and the game's narrative. Most people seem to like their Lord to have a certain degree of usefulness in combat throughout the game, without necessarily breaking the game in half. Uniqueness in design was also a popular idea, particularly in terms of weapon type. It seems people are pretty damn tired of sword lords, which I can't help but imagine is part of the reason for Ephraim and Hector's rampant popularity. The power of this is honestly underrated, I think. Looking at Eliwood as an example again, he's not only a sword lord when that's already the norm in the series, but he's not even particularly powerful in his own game. And he happens to share the spotlight with another sword lord with way more novelty in Lyn, who also happens to meet the player first, which doesn't help Eliwood's tendency to be overshadowed. I genuinely believe if Eliwood had been a lance lord at base, with a horse to really push the knight in charting armor idea, as well as just giving him more utility, he'd be a fair bit more popular, being more useful, unique, and for pushing a stronger thematic perspective. Of course, outside of just making the character more powerful, there's also the option to make the Lord more unique by giving them certain abilities to help them fit some kind of niche that other units can't. This has already been done before, for example the concept of Holy Blood in FE4, or Leadership Stars in Radiant Dawn, or the personal skills in Fire Emblem Fates. And this is where I personally would like to see a real shake-up in the next Lord. For example, picture this. A Lord that doesn't fight at all, but instead focuses on dancing and buffing their allies, something along the lines of Ninian or Azura. For their promotion, they could gain a mount and the ability to heal, making them really come out as a support unit. That could fit in well with a Lord who perhaps isn't very martial by nature, and relies more on wit and charisma to get the job done. Ultimately, we'd like the Lord to at least be a unit that is satisfying to play as in some way, shape or form, whether by being overpowered, or thematically fitting their kind of character, or being extremely unique. So, let's wrap this up. From what I've seen, the most important qualities to give a Lord in order for them to be well received are a likeable and fleshed out character that undergoes some degree of development with a decent array of supports, a strong and unique visual and or voice design, a notable place and well written involvement in their game's plot, and being useful or unique when it comes to gameplay. That description may sound pretty familiar to you, and yeah, a fair number of Lords have already hit those benchmarks pretty well, so it's not like this can't be done. That being said, even if a Lord were to hit these benchmarks, that's no guarantee of total success. Ironically, of the Lords that I just flashed up, I only like 2 of them. While I can appreciate the others to an extent, elements of either their personality, relationship with other characters, or their action during their stories just turns me off. Again, sometimes it doesn't really matter how deep or complex a character is, or how many boxes they tick. They just might not vibe with some people. Conversely, even characters who might be considered bland or a Mary Sue can just hit the right spot for some people. Ultimately, it all comes down to taste. And while it was fun to try and come up with some kind of formula for success, there is no surefire way to capture a player's heart. And it's not necessarily fair to expect one character to do that for everyone, including the upcoming Lord. Let's just hope that whoever they are, they're someone worthy of their title, and don't do something like destroy an innocent country for the sake of furniture. If you've made it this far, thanks very much for watching, and I'd love to hear what you guys think. Is there anything else you'd want to be added? Is there anything that you'd like to see in the next Lord? Do you even want something unique at all? Do you even believe in any kind of template? Me personally, I'm really looking for something unique from my Lord, especially design-wise and in terms of their character. In terms of their design, I really want a Lord that's female. I want a female Lord. I would like a Lord that is perhaps slightly tanned or darker skinned, that doesn't use a sword. Basically, if you played FE6, and you know I green, that's essentially what I want design-wise. From a character perspective, I think there's a lot that can be done with the noble hero mold that we currently have. I know people tend to consider that boring, but I think we actually have kind of a gold mine there, because we have certain expectations built up. And once you've got expectations built up, then you can start subverting them, you can start switching it up on the player. I think Micaiah is a really good example of this in Radiant Dawn. I think she's actually one of the more interesting protagonists in the series, because she actually doesn't even come off as a good guy for the third part of the game. She's essentially the villain. Even though she's still fighting for the good people, she's still fighting the good fight, she's still fighting for her country. But it's twisted in a way that makes her come off as the bad guy. I think that's extremely interesting. I would love to see something more like that. But again, any extra ideas, any answers to the questions that I've given, leave them in the comments down below or leave them on the Reddit thread that I'm going to make. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts and get a real discussion going. But until the next time, I will see you later.
The journey has